All right, let's talk about prokaryotes versus eukaryotes. I don't think that you guys have really heard these words very frequently or at all for many of you previously. So we're going to break them down for you first before we talk about the differences between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. We're still talking about different types of cells, and we've already looked at plant and animal cells, which you guys are more familiar with. And now this is looking at a little bit more detail. So the first thing that I want you to notice is this karyo part in both of these words. Karyo means nucleus. So you can refer to your language of science sheet. You'll see that karyo means nucleus. Pro means first or before. So prokaryotes evolved before there was a nucleus. So we can assume that prokaryotes do not have a nucleus. And in fact, that is true. That is their major defining characteristic, is that they don't have a nucleus. Eukaryotes, the U part means true. So eukaryotes have a true nucleus, meaning animal cells, plant cells, those that we have already talked about, and some others that we'll look at some more later, they do have a nucleus. So that is the major difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. However, there are a couple of other differences, and I would make a Venn diagram, although it wouldn't really, it's not really conducive to that sort of thing. So let's look at all of the parts that we talked about with eukaryotes. So keep in mind that plant and animal cells are eukaryotes. We looked at nucleus and nucleolus. Okay, so the nucleus contains the DNA. The nucleolus inside the nucleus makes the ribosomes. Ribosomes, which make proteins. Cell membrane, or you'll see plasma membrane, those are the same thing. That's the boundary. We've got mighty mitochondria, making our energy. We've got chloroplast that do photosynthesis. We don't have chloroplast, but plants do. We've got Golgi, which packages different chemicals, but then we also have rough and smooth ER, or endoplasmic reticulum. So that was the transport organelle. We also have vacuole and lysosome. So these are essentially specialized bubbles that do specific things. And keep in mind that vacuoles look a little bit different in plants versus animals, but still both have vacuoles. Lysosomes, that has the word lyse, so they break down waste products. We also have cytoskeleton in animal cells, and we have a cell wall in plant cells, so that provides that rigidity or structure and support that all cells really need. Something else that we didn't talk about, because it's not really an organelle, but it's still part of the cell, and those two things are DNA, so instructions for the cell, and cytoplasm. So cytoplasm is it's the liquid, and I would love for you to remember that it is the liquid inside of the cell. Remember, cyto means cell. So all of these other parts, well, aside from cell membrane and cell wall, because those are the boundary parts, that all these other parts that are inside the cell are essentially floating around in the cytoplasm. Okay, so notice that eukaryotes have a lot of different parts, and in general, eukaryotes are complex. Okay, so this is this is after the nucleus evolved. They do have a nucleus. They are much more complex. They are larger in size than simple cells. So prokaryotes are very simple, and they're smaller. And we'll look at some examples in a minute. But first I want to tell you, what are the structures that prokaryotes have? Now, this is a much, much shorter list. Okay, We already know that prokaryote means before the nucleus, so prokaryotes don't have a nucleus, therefore they definitely don't have a nucleolus. They do have ribosomes. They do have cell membrane. Remember, that's the boundary of all cells, so they have to have that. Mitochondria, chloroplast, Golgi, ER, the vacuoles, lysosomes, those are all very kind of advanced structures. So prokaryotes do not have those structures. Prokaryotes don't even really have lysosomes either. And they don't have cytoskeleton. However, some do have cell wall. Okay. Now, keep in mind that ribosomes make proteins, but DNA is what provides the instructions for making those proteins. So prokaryotes do have DNA, and they certainly have cytoplasm. So we've got the DNA and the ribosomes that are kind of just floating around in the cytoplasm. The cell wall and the cell membrane are those boundary parts. And later on, when we look at specialized cells, we'll see a few other structures that are also found in prokaryotes, but I don't want us to get too ahead of ourselves just yet. In general, if you see a drawing, you might see a drawing of a prokaryote that's very simple, and sometimes it has a tail, and we'll talk about what that tail is. I just want you to be aware that there's no nucleus in the prokaryote. So even though it has DNA, the DNA is not in a nucleus. It's kind of floating around in a specific region, but it's not enclosed in a nucleus. And it has ribosomes. So that's pretty much the only thing that you see in a prokaryote is the cell membrane, and sometimes you have that cell wall outside of the cell membrane. DNA inside and the ribosomes inside are floating around in the cytoplasm. The eukaryotes, on the other hand, are a lot more complex. They're bigger. Here's the nucleus. There's probably the nucleolus inside. There's the endoplasmic reticulum network throughout. Some of it is spotted with ribosomes, so that would be the rough ER. You can have the Golgi, you can have the mitochondria. Okay, so there are many different parts in the eukaryote that are not found in the prokaryote. But don't forget that ribosomes, DNA, and cytoplasm are in every single cell, every type of cell. So we still have ribosomes in our eukaryote. But also keep in mind that the DNA is present. It's just going to be inside of the nucleus. It's contained within the nucleus. All right. So some examples of both of these, and you do need to be very familiar with these examples. Eukaryote examples are things like plant cells, animal cells. We're also going to look at fungi. So that's things like mushrooms, but we'll look at the details of that later on. And protists, which I don't think many of you have heard of, but many of you probably have heard of amoeba and paramecium. Those are protists. So protists are typically single-celled eukaryotes, and we'll talk about all of that when we do classification. Prokaryotes, example, notice I said example, not plural, bacteria. All right, so bacteria are the major example of prokaryotes. Do not assume that bacteria have a nucleus. That's not true. They are prokaryotes. They evolved before the nucleus. Okay, so keep that in mind and read the skeleton notes and make sure that you come to class prepared for our activity.